Hi everyone and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. Today we have a special guest that we already had on the show, Maurice Suckling, a renowned designer and officially banned from the Consim Game Jam. We'll talk more about that later. Maurice's portfolio is quite impressive in gaming, not only actual board games, but that's something you can maybe learn a bit more about if you go and watch the interview that we had on the channel a bit earlier. Today, we're going to specifically talk about Crisis 1914, a game about international relations at the beginning of World War I, or actually just before. That is going to be published by Worthington, and it is currently on Kickstarter. I'm extremely late to do that video, so if you're interested in the game and you want to back it, I don't think that you have a lot of time when I would be releasing that video. That would be probably the final hours of the campaign. So not really a good promotional content, but that's not the intent of that video, so that's fine. So it's on Kickstarter right now, and the game invites players to navigate complex diplomatic landscape of the time, balancing power, prestige, and peace in between players. And I wanted to chat with Maurice to talk about this latest design, also because I'm really interested in historical games that are not focusing necessarily on the operation of war, but actually how war appears, but also how war ends. And in that case, we are on the former part of the equation. So thanks a lot, Maurice, for being here and discussing with me for this very last minute interview. And I'm sorry for my poor planning. That's nice. But it's great to have you here. How are you doing?
Fred, I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me back. It's a real pleasure and something of a surprise to be able to catch up with you. You're a difficult man to kind of catch up with.
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry about that. We have a few projects. I think I'm still supposed to give you a data extract of different things that I still haven't done. Yeah, I completely forgot about that. I am extremely unreliable. I hope that we never work on anything together.
You know, if you're reliably unreliable, I suppose there's a certain quality in that.
Exactly. That's what I should tell Joe, because I'm not sure he would be convinced, but I will try to convince him. But going back to Crisis 1914, so as I said in the introduction, it's set in a very specific time in history, just at the beginning of World War I. And I was wondering, why did you choose to cover this period in your game, while most of your game that you did before were really focused on the action of war and not the emergence of war, and mostly on also the actual act of fighting, whereas this one is very diplomatic. So why that shift, and what were you trying to do?
Well, in some ways, it chose me, this topic. It's sort of been bedeviling me, preoccupying me for actually decades. So since I first played diplomacy back in the early 1980s.
Yeah, probably a while ago. Yeah.
I thought this is really fascinating. This idea of sort of negotiating prior to actually hostilities beginning. Of course, diplomacy doesn't actually work out that way. The first moves are really you initiating war. But I've been fascinated in this aspect of military history, of this sort of the immediate precursor to specifically World War I has fascinated me for a long time. And in fact, I worked on prototypes for this game over many decades, not knowing what I was doing, not really knowing what I was trying to get at. And I also I personally didn't have the design tools, but also in general, I think that the industry, the space, the hobby didn't really have them. I hadn't really identified what they were. And I think that come the advent of Euro games, and we've absorbed some of these mechanics and found ways of leveraging them into historical games. So yeah, I just didn't know how to do it, really. I mean, every time I attempted it prior to more or less the last few years, they just kept turning into war games. They kept turning into colonial imperial expansion games, which wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in how do you kind of thread this needle of trying to assert your diplomatic prestige in a crisis and yet not triggering war. So in this case, you lose the game if you start the war.
Okay.
So and to your sort of other point, I think that I'm just becoming increasingly more interested in these stories that we're not telling through our game design. So the beginnings of wars, the ends of wars, the political complexity and multifactional aspects of warfare, the irregular warfare. Now, there are people who are doing this work. Brian Train, for one, has been doing this irregular warfare, been focusing on this for some considerable time, and also kind of lots of modern or close to contemporary topics. So, and of course, Coin and Volko and that whole series are looking at that kind of multifactional counterinsurgency warfare, which I've kind of dabbled in a little bit, but I'm finding my interests are just sort of being pulled in these other directions that are to do with tops and tails of war.
Which I think is really interesting, and in a way connects to two other discussions that we had on the channel. So a couple of months ago, we had a discussion with Steven Ramganzas regarding the coin model in itself, and he was talking about the limits of the coin model and how we needed to go beyond it to better represent conflict in the future, and how it was actually really good at doing some of the things that it was doing, but also sometimes missing the point. And he was raising this comment around the fact that we talk really a lot about the waging war itself, but often more critical was how does the war start and how is the war ended. It's often being more critical than how the war was led in the middle. And I think this really resonates with this project. It was also something that we discussed with NB, the designer of Cross Bronx Expressway, who came on the show to talk about, he had this really thought-provoking article called All War Games Propaganda. And one of his points that I thought were really compelling was the fact that we decide to, as designer, represent specific things only representing specific things about warfare, whether we want it or not, whether we're careful about the resources that we use to actually portray history. Just the fact that we have that focus and that we don't talk about the other things is actually narrowing our perspective of what is history and how our conflicts resolved, which I think is quite interesting. So you mentioned diplomacy. Like in your endeavor of trying to look at war differently and look at history differently, were there other games that inspired you to do something, to do this game?
Yeah, Churchill. So Mark Herman's Churchill, 2015, I think that came out. That was I think a key moment for me playing that game. I just love that perspective, that very grand strategic perspective that makes us think about it sort of disrupts these ideas that the Allies are working together. So just for the benefit of those of you who don't know, that game is a sort of semi-co-op, a co-opetition game for 3 players. The Soviets, the US, and the UK fight against the game system, which is the Axis powers. And in order to win, all 3 of you have to defeat those Axis powers. But it's a bit more complicated than that, that you're also competing against each other for in effect, the post-war peace. And if you get too far ahead, if you do too well, you don't win. The other two powers, in effect, sort of the sort of narrative wrapper of the rule set is that, well, they gang up on you, that they kind of form an alliance. That means that you lose the peace. You might dominate, but in fact you dominate to such an extent that it's unsustainable in a post-war world. So I loved the complexity of that. I mean, it's not a super complex game, but I love the complex thinking that is being represented there. The sort of unsettling notions about what it means to be victorious. If we think about sort of a conventional way, a sort of 1970s, 1980s design approach World War II might be, hey, if I'm playing as the German faction, and if I can have one unit in supply in Berlin in April 1945, I win, I think we would all agree at odds with what we can imagine the OKW might be thinking in 1939 as their sort of war aims, right? So we have this sort of weird, distorting hindsight lens that's kind of just problematic in terms of, it's not, what are we representing there? We're also, just to jump back to your other point, we've really come from a tradition for all sorts of historical reasons, but we have war games that have really purported to put politics to one side and say, well, it's a war game, so let's focus on the military aspect of it. But the reality is that there's still any statement that says let's have no politics here is a political statement, right?
It's madness. Yeah.
So that's really what's been going on with these kinds of designs, is that it's really a sort of, it purports to be an apolitical game, but it's really a militaristic political fantasy that says, well, politicians just get to be quiet until, you know, the big boys have dealt with the war and everything's tidied up until they need us again, right? Now, that's a very militaristic mindset, which, okay, we can understand where that has come from. And from a military perspective, I completely understand that. But, you know, these are not games that have made attempts, you know, I'm saying Churchill is an exception here, but have not made attempts to accommodate the functioning of democracy, the way in which, well, strategic choices are predicated on democratic expediency, or there are things that democracies need to do. They might need to launch a second front in order for, I don't know, Roosevelt to be re-elected or something, right? So we're doing a disservice to the complexity and really the fascinating stories inside the history by just kind of forgetting that stuff, by putting it to one side. We're losing all this historical texture by just focusing on, hey, well, let's just, you know, we got two or more opposing forces, let's go at it, and once I've destroyed you, that's the end. I mean, there are very few examples in history where conquest has not been ultimately returned by some form of resistance or some consequences that mean that it's far more complicated than just, well, I took your capital and so, you know, the war was won and that was the end of the story. It almost never is the end of the story. There's almost always more to come. And, you know, I think we've got used to our history being too neat and tidy by having these sort of tops and tails that kind of, here's a war and it begins and then it ends. It's a shame. And you know, even in conventional wars, or somewhat largely conventional wars like Napoleonic wars, we know that there are examples of, you know, Napoleon takes Moscow and that doesn't end things.
It doesn't. It doesn't change. Like, it's even worse. Like, it probably shouldn't have. Yeah, that's interesting. And so there is something that is. You touched a bit upon it, on the fact that this has been slightly changing over maybe the last 5 to 10 years only. If I'm thinking back at games that are looking at the emergence of war in the 70s or the 80s, I don't have a lot of examples. And when I do have examples, they are pretty abstract. The one that comes to mind, and a game that I've had for a long time in my collection, and I kind of dream or redo a version of it, is Jim Dunnigan's Origins of World War II, which is a very simple, almost party game, like you could say, where you have a set of influence, you place them in different countries, you challenge each other and everything. And it's a pretty simple game like this. But apart from that, there isn't really much. But we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years actually an emergence of more of those topics in different systems. You talked about Churchill. I think that's a really good example. There is, for example, the expansion to Fire in the Lake, Sovereign of Discord, that is looking at what was happening before the war in Vietnam and the transition between the end of the French Empire in Indochina to the emergence of the Vietnam War. There are more of those topics that are coming up, and we see designers coming with different approaches, trying to cover different part of history in different ways. Why do you think this is happening now?
So I think a few reasons. By the way, I'll just add, so Jim Dunnigan also did Origins of World War One as well, which was sort of similar. And I think one of the reasons is something I mentioned earlier, which is that we've got the tools to do it now. We've through Eurogames, we've got mechanics that allow us to approach things in a slightly different way. Both those Jim Dunnigan games are essentially, I mean, apart from the title, they're in large ways indistinguishable from conventional contemporary war games, right? They've got CRTs, combat result tables, and you roll against odds to add or remove influence. You know, when I played that Origins of World War One game, it was sort of unsatisfying to me. I felt like I wasn't really involved I didn't really understand the dynamics of the diplomacy involved. I felt like I was playing a sort of war game, a proto war game that just had this narrative wrapper that was different. So I think that we've got tools now that we didn't used to have. I think is one of the reasons.
And just for context for people, those Jim Dunnigan's game is that you're going to have a set of influence points that each faction is going to be able to deploy in different areas, and then you're going to resolve conflict against other players that have their influence there. The thing is that the only narrative arc that is being built in those games is different countries are going to have different number of influence at different turns. So you're going to build up, for example, a specific country. Another is going to be strong at the beginning and then trying to maintain. And it's really about resource allocation, pretty much. And it's, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, They look like, I don't remember quite what they were called in that game, but they essentially look like, resource points that are indistinguishable from industrial power in a more conventional war game, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just, hey, how can I move these into the right place, get the right odds, get the right die rolls, and therefore I get the treaties secured that I need to win to get the victory points. But so yes, I think tools is a massive part of that, and I think related to that is the marketplace is accommodating it, which means that publishers and designers are all feeling as if, oh, there are these untapped topics now that we've got ways. Not only do we have ways of addressing them, but we also have a potential market. We have people who might be interested in this, and it might even broaden out the historical board games hobby further than people were just interested in military history. We might be able to tap into some more of that more broadly mainstream audience, and quite apart from that, I mean, just there's a USP, as a unique selling point to games that approach a topic that no other game has ever done. If you do a Waterloo game, it's got to be pretty spectacular. You've got to be doing something pretty unusual for it to kind of stand out above the others, right? But if you're doing a game, there aren't many games on the July Crisis, for example. You've got more chance of it being noticed.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. In a way, like we are reaching a level of maturity that makes it possible for also people to explore, both in terms of mechanics, but also general interest, and also there is almost a commercial incentive to explore new territories, which is quite interesting. But in a way, I'm not sure that's totally true when you see the results of some pre-orders of, for example, American Civil War games that are being published like year over year, even at GMT. I'm always baffled by those numbers. I'm like, again, that tired hex encounter system that was made in the 80s, that is full of dice roll modifiers, that is a pain in the ass to play, and you keep playing those battles again and again, and they get the numbers. And I mean, yeah, fair enough. Well, so maybe I think that's really interesting. It means that more than one thing is replacing the other, is that it's expanding so much that there is more room for everyone, which is quite nice.
Yeah, it's not that they're disappearing. It's just adding this extra stream onto what exists already. In the case of the war game space, those publishers tend to know that audience very well, and they market to them. But now there's this additional possibility that they can reach out to this other audience, and part of that challenge will be that marketing bridge. How do you get to those other players who are playing, I don't know, Dominion or Camel Up and those kinds of gamers? Is there a way to reach them? Is there a way for war games publishers, or traditionally war games publishers, to reach them?
And we've been talking now about you've been talking about like tools that came from Eurogame and everything. I think it's probably a good time. We're 20 minutes into the discussion and we still haven't talked about the game specifically. Very classic of us when we talk together. Not surprised. But can you tell us a bit about the system itself? Like, so what are those tools that you've been using? So how does 1914 works? How do you show that tension between the different political powers? Who are the players? How do they interact with each other? And what's their victory condition?
So you asked a lot of questions there. So remind me again. I'm just going to let me start.
So sorry, I asked too many questions because I was thinking about, we need to cover all those things. So my first question is, what is the overall system of 1914?
Okay, so in 1914, in July, the historical situation is we've got these 5 major states who are reacting to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, June 28th, Sarajevo. We've got these 5 major states. We've got Austria-Hungary, we've got Russia, we've got Germany, we've got France, and we've got Britain. Mm. But it wasn't the case that these states operated as monoliths, where one representative, say, sort of had a view about how to respond, and then the story develops from there. We have a situation where even if we identified key individuals within those states, they're in a situation where they're attempting to corral or shepherd people with disparate views. We've got doves and we've got hawks and we've got some people in between, and they're attempting to kind of corral these different perspectives into a coherent response to the crisis that is related to how everyone else is responding. So in a way, then, I was looking for a metaphor that represents this idea of, well, how do I kind of shepherd these potentially disparate views and try and form this into a coherent response? So the metaphor I have is tableau building and hand management, right? Mm. So I've got a deck of cards. Each player is representing a key statesman in the relevant, with regards to that relevant state. And each player has a deck of cards that represent mostly individuals, but sometimes key ideas like alliances and so on, that they have some agency over. They have some ability to control that deck in order to put cards on their tableau that represent their position each week. And each week, there are 6 weeks. At the end of each week, there's a scoring round happens and you get points, right? Prestige points. That's how well you've exerted your diplomatic pressure. Diplomatic pressure is measured by values on the cards, which range from 0, meaning that person was a dove, which did not want war, or a 4, that person was belligerent. Anyway, so you've got a situation where your players are attempting to, they have some ability to control that deck, but they don't have full agency. Their agency is constrained. They might have things that they want to do, but someone pitches up into that cabinet meeting and takes things in a different direction than what they had anticipated or what they were expecting, which is very much what we see in the history. We might have a situation such as with Austria-Hungary, where Count Berthold, that's the player plays as Count Berthold, who was the foreign minister. He was wanting war. He wanted war with Serbia. He didn't want a European-wide war, but he had significant opposition, at least in the form of Count Teaser, who was the prime minister of Hungary, who was pushing him and making it very difficult for him to get what he wanted. So we have cards in the deck, in each player's deck, that represent these doves who are pulling you in the other direction. That said, there are sometimes hawks who are so belligerent that it's making your position difficult. That's putting you in a position where you might over-egg the pudding and create too much tension and push people closer to war. And as I said, in this game, if you provoke someone into mobilizing, well, you will lose in this game. So in very sort of broad terms, hand management and tableau building is the metaphor that I have for this kind of constrained agency that the historical actors had.
That's a super interesting way to approach it, to show the diversity of point of view within a state and how you have to resolve those tensions as a statesman and to drive your own position. Then my natural next question is, what are the victory conditions? So you said how you can lose. You feel you can lose by triggering the war, but how are different players trying to win then?
So winning is a measure of who has the most prestige points at the end of the game. And prestige points are won by, so I mentioned that these cards, the game is obviously card driven. These cards have these diplomatic pressure values from 0 to 4. And whoever has the highest total of diplomatic pressure points at the end of that week, there are 6 weeks, 6 scoring weeks. Whoever has the highest diplomatic pressure total at the end of that week will score prestige, will score usually 3 prestige. But there are other ways of scoring prestige. Anyway, so who's collected the most prestige at the end of the game will win. However, when you are generating diplomatic pressure and going up this score track in an attempt to secure the most prestige, you're almost certainly generating an amount of tension along the way. So you're trying to figure out, how far do I push this? If I am playing as Austria-Hungary and the Russian player is still going and still pushing things further up that score track, I might be inclined to go further than them, or I might decide I'm going to pull back so that yes, they'll win the prestige, but they'll also generate a lot of tension, which means that's going to hinder their ability to diplomatically maneuver in the following weeks. So there are these three interlinking systems. One is prestige, that's victory points. One is tension, that's essentially lose points. If you hit 6 tension, you've provoked someone into mobilizing, in which case all bets are off and the game is gonna end pretty soon after that. And we also have this diplomatic pressure, which is how you get both of those. You're just trying to balance. You're watching other players and also trying to manage your own hand, because you might not be able to land on the exact diplomatic pressure total that you wanted to, depending on how you've managed to kind of manage your deck.
And what was the biggest challenge in terms of design to actually make that balance happen? What did you struggle with? Was it the integration of all the historical research that you've had, or finding the right balance between that tension and prestige and all that? What did you struggle with in making this one?
That's a fun question. The truth is that I struggled for many years, not really knowing what I was trying to do. Like I said, I just hadn't really identified not only what I was trying to do or how I was trying to do it. And the game kept devolving into a sort of imperial conquest game, which on fairly conventional lines of, hey, if I get more of something, then that's better. Now, so the challenge was not only understanding what I was really trying to do, but inside that was understanding the complex relationship of prestige, that when I secure prestige, that is good, but also is potentially bad. It's a way in which I'm generating tension, which might lose me the game. So understanding that dynamic, that kind of, if you like, core systems thinking, when I understood that, then yes, so then I was kind of over a certain hump, but then it was like, well, how do I balance that? How do I make that make sense? Bearing in mind, this is a game that plays for 1 to 5 players, and that has certain complications. So the way it works is, if you have 1 player, you play as Austria-Hungary. If you have 2, you add Russia. If you have 3, you add Germany. 4, France, and 5, you add Britain. The point being that inside everyone's deck, or at least inside the first 3 states that I mentioned, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany, you have cards that, depending on how you play and certain choices that you make, will actually increase the risk that you will lose yourself. You will kind of drive your own. There are people inside your state who will cause you to mobilize because you've taken certain risks. For example, if you play an ultimatum card as Austria-Hungary, well, that's good because you get some prestige for that. But it also introduces the likelihood that you will then mobilize, which is bad because you will lose if you can't control that event happening. A general mobilization as opposed to a mobilization just against Serbia.
Yeah, okay. But that's really interesting. And in terms of balance, how do you say how probable in your game it is that World War I doesn't happen?
It sort of depends how aggressive people play. Like I said, it's a constrained agency. So it's possible there are some times that I guess the cards could come out in such a way, and you make certain choices that you really limit your scope of operations. But you can be quite conservative. You can play it much less riskily. You can dial everything back, and you could do that probably every time, right? Probably every time you could avoid war, but you almost certainly won't win because you won't drive your diplomatic pressure up high enough to score the prestige you need to win. If you are more gung-ho and you are more adventurous, it happens a lot more that you'll just lose. You will push things too far. You end up mobilizing yourself, or you've caused someone else to mobilize. So it's a measure of what kind of risks you're prepared to tolerate.
Willing to take. Yeah, that's really interesting. In the beginning of our discussion, you were talking about the fact that you were interested in beginning and ends of war a lot more, and you're releasing this game with Worthington now on Kickstarter on 1914, just before World War One. But you've also was announced that you signed also with Fourth Circle on a game called 1905, which is the date of the end of the Russo-Japanese War. What's the relationship between those two games? What do they share, and what do they not share?
Yeah, Peace 1905, I think, is its current working title, and you're partly to blame because, of course, it came out of your game jam, which I hadn't really intended to do, but sort of did, and then worked with these other guys, S.P. Shaman and Nathaniel Buckley and Bill Sullivan, and yeah, so we ended up making this game. The relationship is so a lot of that kind of core thinking that had been going on while I was tussling with 1914, with the July Crisis game, ended up sort of being applicable to Peace 1905, like you say, a game about treaty negotiations, and in there that's we have a similar situation where you've got Japan and you've got Russia, and they both want the war to end, but on their terms. We've got a treaty that has a number of issues, and you want to win as many of those issues as you can, in a sense, because you want victory points. However, diplomacy is complicated, and humans are complicated, and if you win too hard, you'll kind of hear an echo of this coming back to my experience with Churchill. If you win too hard, well, you don't win, because someone's going to storm out of that negotiation table and say, I'm not going to sign this deal then, in which case, well, the eyes of world opinion are on you, and you're the jerk because you had the opportunity to end this war, but you didn't. And that's, for the diplomats charged with the task of getting that treaty signed and on their terms, that's a failure. So you can see a relationship. There is a relationship between this. In both games, we have this term tension.
Yeah.
We don't have prestige in Peace 1905, but we have victory points. So yeah, there's this same sort of relationship between, hey, I want to win, but I don't want to win too much. Part of the skill is judgment, which is a fine point and an interesting way of trying to represent some of this more complex nature, some of this more complex subject matter.
And do you feel that for you, it's maybe the beginning of an informal series, 1914, 1905, or are you thinking about covering other periods of time?
I am thinking about other situations that would be well served by these sorts of approaches. That's to say, it's not just simply domination and conquest type mechanics, where if I get more, and I win and I dominate. That I'm interested in, these largely forgotten or certainly underserved topics, these narratives in history, that we now have some tools that we can use to give them some life. So yes, there are things in my mind that I think, those are interesting topics that I think I could do something with. I mean, I guess at the same time, I don't want to just sort of now become typecast into doing those things. There's still other things that I want to explore.
Yeah,
might be quite different.
But when you do come up with another one of those, please come back. I think when you're getting closer to publication for 1905, it would also be great to have you here so we can actually a bit deep dive into this one and how it came to be and how it evolved since the Consim Game Jam. Maybe the thing that I would like to talk about, just to conclude this discussion, is how has the campaign been going so far? Are you happy with the result? Do you feel like there is an appetite on the historical gaming hobby for this kind of game? What was your reflection 3 weeks in almost into the campaign?
Yeah, so I think that we've got something just over 400 backers, which I think is fairly good for, Worthington are not the biggest publisher, but they're not the smallest. But I think that for them, this represents a better than average campaign. I think that, I'm delighted if one person wants to play one of my games and is excited about it, then I'm pretty happy about that. So 400 live humans is pretty great. I mean, I think that I guess this comes back to something I was saying earlier. One of the challenges for war games or erstwhile war games publishers is how do they reach out to that kind of less mainstream, sorry, that less mainstream war games market, but that more broad mainstream board game market. And so I don't know the answer to that, but my approach is just to keep making games and come on shows like this and talk about them and hope that the word spreads and people get interested in, like I said, not just finding those other people, but also persuading. It's a task, right? Because you've also got to persuade these long-term grognards that they want to play this thing that's kind of different from what they're used to. So it's a task on both sides, and I don't imagine it would be accomplished anytime soon or that easily.
We'll keep spreading the word. So we'll do it here. You'll be invited, of course, in the future. I think if we probably should do a panel on maybe with other designers at some point about starting and finishing war. I think that could be really interesting to have a discussion about this. I think that would be awesome. I would like to thank you for taking the time today for talking us about the game 1914, released by Crisis 1914, released by Worthington. I will have added the link to the Kickstarter campaign in the description, and we'll hope to see you soon, maybe for a teach and play in the future. If Worthington does release some vassal modules of some of your games, that would be pretty good. Then we could do some teach and play, and we'll see about that. So just a note for Grant here, like, if please release some a vassal module or TTS module of Maurice's game, please. That would be really, really great. Thanks everyone for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, comment, and all this, and you can support us on Ko-fi. Bye bye.